Welcome to another episode of Bright Headed Publishing Podiobook Book Club. I am your host, Kelly Morgan. I'm excited because today I want to introduce you to seasoned veteran Joey O'Connor. Joey is an award-winning screenwriter, author, speaker, and artist coach. He is the author of 21 books for adults and young adults, and he's written a wonderful book of fiction called Among Kings, which is a historical fiction novel. He is the founder and executive director of Grove Center for the Arts and Media, a nonprofit arts organization dedicated to cultivating the spiritual life and creative work of artists. He is also the co-founder of the Congo Reform Association, a nonprofit that uses story, film, and social media to help end the conflict in Congo. It is my pleasure to be speaking with him today. Please welcome the newest member of the book club, author Joey O'Connor. Joey, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and being a member of the book club. Welcome. How are you?
I'm doing well, Kelly. So good to be with you today.
Yeah, I'm really excited. You are a veteran, a seasoned author. You've got 11 books out there, and so I'm really excited to hear about your journey, the things that you've learned along the way, and then, of course, any insights that you can give to anybody who's maybe just starting out, maybe thinking about being published or starting to go down that road. And so anything that you can provide would be of value, I'm sure.
Sure. I'd love to encourage new and seasoned authors today in any way that would help them out.
Yeah. So tell me about your journey, how you became an author, and then we can get into your latest book.
Okay, great. Well, when I was in college, I was involved a lot with working with youth during the summer. I worked with different kind of youth ministries and camps, and I had a couple mentors who were writers. And so during my college years, I started doing what's commonly called as ghostwriting, assisting them in their projects. And so that's really how I got my feet wet. And then by my senior year of college, went to school in Northern California. I began writing just really small articles to youth magazines. And lo and behold, they began to get picked up. So as a college student, I was getting a check for $25. And so I was really excited about that. So after college, I continued working with youth and continued working with a couple of these youth ministry mentors that I had. And I began to get ideas for publishing my own books. And one of the gentlemen that was helping me out, he had an in with a publisher. And so I went through the whole process of putting a nonfiction book proposal together, book specifically targeted for high school students. And lo and behold, it got picked up. And so one thing led to another. But, the real irony here is I was a Spanish major in college. So I never had these great dreams and aspirations to become the great American writer. I wasn't an English major. My grammar was, frankly, pretty poor. But it was really through learning Spanish that I was forced to learn English grammar. So for those listening, you may want to just consider, you probably come to your writing with a whole different set of life skills that you've achieved along the way, and you can begin dumping into those things and utilizing those things as a writer. That's really kind of my, a path I had never planned on. And then, I just kept writing and it's been a part of my professional life for many years now.
So you write both fiction and nonfiction?
Yeah, the majority of my books early in my writing career were nonfiction books. I worked with youth, and then I was working with married couples, wrote a number of books, kind of marriage humor books, actually. Jumped around to a number of different genres, and it was later in my 40s when I began actually working on screenwriting and novel writing. So if I could go back and say, okay, what is one thing that I would have done differently knowing what I know now? I would have probably just picked one genre and stuck with it, because that's really how you build an extended readership over time. for those listening that really want to build the list of followers and readers that they have. But, my career has been what it is, and you learn certain things along the way. There's definitely times when I was writing, I had 3 small children at home. I had to go from book to book to book to get that book finished and the next one in the can to pay the bills, So, fortunately, I'm in a place right now where I can really be more selective and more decisive with the projects that I want to work on now.
So what do you prefer to write? Do you prefer to write fiction or do you prefer to write nonfiction?
Oh, that's a great question. For where I'm at this stage of my life, I'm 56 years old. I really prefer fiction. The book I most recently wrote is called Among Kings. That's involved 13 years of research. Now, it's historical fiction because the story is set in the late 1800s, but the cast of characters, the majority of them in the book, are true historical characters. So that was a challenge in itself of writing historical fiction with real true history that happened, but putting it in a fictional setting. And but the book I'm working on now, it's pure straight fiction, but based upon modern day realities. So I prefer fiction, and specifically, I really do enjoy screenwriting as well, because that craft is very different than writing a fictional novel. So I do like a couple different genres, but I'm really interested in building story worlds now.
So let's talk about screenwriting for a moment, because that interests me, because it seems like most people say, I wrote this book and I can see it being a movie.
Right.
But I know that it's very different the way that you write, because I think you're writing for visual, because it's going to be a screenplay rather than a book where a book provides all this detail. A screenplay, you can see the detail. Am I correct?
Correct. Yeah. The current project that I just completed, it's called Among Kings, and it began as a screenplay. My brother-in-law came to me 13 years ago, said, "Hey, I have a story of this true historical character, African-American man named William Shepard, who was born in Virginia the year the Civil War ended. He ended up becoming the first Presbyterian missionary to the Congo in 1890. He ended up taking on King Leopold of Belgium, and it led to the first international human rights trial." So we began 2 years of researching his story and writing the screenplay. And so the craft of screenwriting, where it really veers different than writing a novel, a screenplay, you want to get as much on the page in at least amount of words as possible. So a screenplay is really just dialogue and the narrative story, but it's very terse, specific writing, and it follows, in most cases, what's commonly known as a 3-act structure. So there's certain things that have to happen in each one of those acts. Very common, people who've studied English are familiar with the hero's journey. There's things that have to happen in that 3-act structure within the discipline and the craft of screenwriting, which there's similarities and carryover in terms of 3-act structure for a novel. But as everyone knows, a novel has a lot more words on the page. You can be very descriptive. You go into characters' motivations, what they're seeing and doing. It's much more descriptive. Whereas a screenplay, you really only know what that character is doing by what they say and what they do. And so it's very terse, but it's really a challenging craft. But you're right. It's very visual in orientation.
Yeah, I would think so. I think screenplay writing is something that I've always thought about. I've never done it, right? I've never written a screenplay. I have in my head.
Sure.
But I've never actually put it down on paper.
Yeah.
When I read books that are movies, you always know that the book has so much more detail. So
right, exactly.
I think that's fascinating. So I'm interested in your book, because I think historical fiction would be difficult to write because things have really happened. But now we have this fictional subtext. So Tell us about the book.
William Shepard, as I mentioned, he's a true historical figure. He was responsible for bringing down King Leopold of Belgium, who had enslaved the entire Congo nation for the rubber trade at the end of the 1800s. So the story world that my brother-in-law and I built out, and what I wrote about in the novel, the story world is the Great Scramble for Africa, which started with the Berlin Conference in 1884 and into 1885. That's where all the European nations basically said, okay, we're going to get our slice of the African cake. They're going to divide it up. And the huge tragedy was that not one African was invited into that conference in Europe, which was held in Germany. And there was no decision on part of any African who was able to influence those decisions. And so we all know there was the scramble of Africa, much of Europe gobbled up different parts of Africa, and it was Leopold who took the Congo. So you have the story world of the Great Scramble, you have the Industrial Revolution, where it's turn of the century. So Thomas Edison is wiring whole cities across the world for electricity. What does he need for the installation on that wiring? It's rubber. There's the bicycle boom, the automobile boom. What do we need for those tires? It's rubber. And what is the Congo filled with but rubber? So Leopold just seized the entire Congo region. And so Shepard, he went with another white man as partners. His partner was Samuel Lapsley. So here you have a white man and a black man who developed this dear friendship as they go 1,000 miles up the Congo River, and they set up their mission. Well, what did they discover when they got there was that Leopold was ruling and ruining the entire Congo. So in the 20 years that Shepard was there, he was speaking out against the atrocities, and ultimately Shepard or King Leopold brought a slander lawsuit against him, and it led to the first international human rights trial. So Shepard is this huge human rights hero that in terms of Black History Month and people's knowledge in America, people just don't know of him. And so when Ken and I started researching the story, what we discovered is that everything going on in the Congo today leads back to over 100 years ago when Leopold stole the Congo. And what most people also don't know, many people are familiar with the genocide that happened in Rwanda 25 years ago, but what they don't know is that that genocide pushed west into the Congo. It led to 2 Congo world wars, and in the past, in the past 25 years, over 6 million people have died in the Congo. So, in terms of historical fiction, we wanted to shine a bright light on the Congo over 100 years ago, so people would take notice what's going on in the Congo today and hopefully do something about that. We have really good friends that live and work in the Eastern Congo in the town of Goma. I've been to the Eastern Congo and spent time with the people there and been a part of my friends' work there. So that's the connection is connecting the history of the past with the story to the present day. And so in the actual novel, I weave both true historical figures with some fictional figures because it's much like painting an impressionistic painting. If people look at Monet's water lilies or his bridge, you see all the colors and hints, and you see, okay, that's a bridge, but it's a little bit fuzzy. Well, in the same way, in historical fiction, those lines do get blurred, even though there's true historical facts that have happened along the way.
So you had mentioned that he's not a well-known figure in Black history, right, and he's not, but you're saying that he was American.
Absolutely. He went to Hampton University, which back then was called Hampton Technological Institute. That's right in Hampton, Virginia. The professor who taught his classes, who was his mentor, was Booker T. Washington. Because of Shepard's fame and notoriety, before that, when he was in the Congo, he discovered a hidden African nation that no white man, Stanley was a contemporary of his, but no white man had discovered this. And the notion was, the incorrect notion was that all Africans are savages. Well, when Shepard discovered this highly advanced tribe in terms of metalworking, design, architecture, you name it, it was highly advanced. Because of that discovery, when he went back to London, he was the first Black man inducted into the Royal Geographic Society. He had tea with Queen Victoria when he came back to the U.S. Over the course of his lifetime, he met with 4 U.S. presidents, and the art collection he brought back from the Cuba Kingdom, that art collection is still now in the Hampton University Museum, and it is one of the finest African art collections in the United States. So Shepard is just this legendary figure, and we think the world really needs to know about him because he ultimately stood for human rights and justice.
And you said that the things that he did then are still mattering today in the Congo.
Absolutely. I have not been to the Kasai region. Him and Lapsley established their mission in a little village called Luebo. It's really in the center of the Congo. I was more to the east, but still to the day, from the research that I've done, the Presbyterian Church that he established is still there. The work that he's done in terms of his social work with the people there, his ministry, it still has fingerprints and influence to this very day.
And I'm sure he's well known in the Congo.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, Lapsley, he died only 2 years into the mission, and Lapsley is actually buried in the Congo.
Wow, that is really fascinating. And so is it because of the book and all the things that you discovered, have you actually gone to the Congo and done mission and volunteer work?
Yes. Yeah. I went there in the summer of 2015.
And so was it the book that kind of opened that up for you? Because did you know much about it before you started researching this guy?
Oh, no, we knew nothing. What's interesting, my brother-in-law, Ken Straw, he came to me 13 years ago and he said, hey, 10 years before that, he had heard a small piece on NPR radio about William Shepard. And he had, so he researched his life. Ken wasn't a writer, and so he had long had the dream of wanting to tell William Shepard's story. I had certainly known nothing about it. And so when we sit down and talk to people about the Great Scramble for Africa, about the Industrial Revolution, and then when Shepard came back to America, what had been instituted? Well, the Jim Crow laws. So Shepard as a man had this tremendous freedom in Africa, but when he comes home, the Jim Crow laws are established. And the premise that we, I believe, make very strong in the book, it raises the question, which is the more savage nation?
Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic book. So what are you currently working on?
I'm currently working on a new book called The Mineral Curse. And what many people don't know is that the Congo and the Great Lakes region of Africa is the most mineral-rich section in the world, okay? And it's estimated that the Congo has more than $28 trillion worth of natural resources: gold, tin, tantalum, tungsten, coltan. Everything that fuels our cell phones, our televisions, our modern technologies, it comes from minerals out of the Congo. And so the book that I'm writing, it points back to the past with what was called the mineral curse, of where Leopold was stealing the ivory and the rubber out of the Congo. Well, today that theft is still occurring in many ways. The Eastern Congo is one of the most violent places in the world. So my story sets a human rights lawyer in the Congo trying to rescue a kidnapped doctor before an evil conspiracy takes over the world's mineral resources.
Sounds like a movie.
Hopefully.
Sounds definitely like a movie. So when do you anticipate that book being finished?
Well, I've blocked out the chapters, the structure, and now I'm just really working through the first draft. So that book's gonna take me 5 to 6 months to write. But I'm really trying to take a lot of current research. One thing that we encountered when we were researching Among Kings about William Shepard, Shepard's story was so amazing. We kept saying, you just can't make this stuff up. It's truth is stranger than fiction. Well, in the same way with the research that I'm doing now with how nations are going after the Congo's mineral resources, and you look at the world financial markets and cryptocurrency and human rights issues and the conversation here in America, it's like all you have to do is just start writing, because it's like, what is this world that we live in? And so the real goal here with the new book is to connect the past to the present, but ultimately ask the question, because the question I'm asking in Among Kings is, William Shepard took such a courageous stand for justice, and it's really asking the question, how can I, as an individual, make this world a more beautiful place? How can I have an imprint and an influence in a way that's going to bring more positivity and goodness to people's lives than all the death and theft and destruction that we see around us?
So when you were researching him, and it sounds to me, because you've authored so many books, that you have maybe a process that you do before you start writing. And I would imagine that a big part of that process is research, especially when you were doing the historical fiction.
Yeah.
In doing the research, you said over 13 years in doing this research. Did you find that finding out things on him was hard? Was it hard to find information on him?
No, because in terms of, there's only two major nonfiction books that have been written about Shepard himself. There's other books that have been written about Leopold and the Congo. So mostly all the research was done in that nonfiction domain. But what was challenging, as I've communicated to other people, is that throughout the process, we were taking 1,000 pounds worth of information and trying to stuff it into a 50-pound bag. There was so much information. And so, if there is one of your listeners working on historical fiction or any type of project that involves a lot of research, the process I'm going through now is asking the question, what is most essential? What does the reader need to know? Because they don't need to know everything. If they want to know everything about the subject, they can read all the nonfiction books about it. And so that's where I have stacks of nonfiction books. But in order to have a storyline that has pace and momentum, you just can't info dump all over the place, because people will get lost. It really comes down to how do we present this main character with a big problem, and what's he going to do to get over it?
Yeah, so it sounds to me like you have a process. Now, is the process for you the same if you're writing fiction versus writing nonfiction?
Well, no, I would say those are two different disciplines, because the nonfiction really just deals with facts and scenarios. With the fiction, you're dealing with story worlds. So I'll give you an example. In writing the historical fiction story of Among Kings, in my research, I have William Shepard's Memoirs. It's called Presbyterian Pioneers in the Congo. So he details out his journey over 20 years in the Congo. But because he was a Black man living in a white Victorian world, and the image of a Victorian man back then was, you don't show any of your cards. You keep this strong front, and I understand that's for survival in many cases. So in Shepard's writings, you don't really see his heart revealed. You don't see his motivations. You don't see his feelings about things. So when you're writing fiction, you're delving into those deep emotional aspects of your character. So did I have to make some of that up? Yes, I did. But I tried to do it consistently by visually showing, what do we learn about Shepard by what he does? Because what we do reveals that inner life, our character. So that was part of my process there, is like, okay, I just need to show William in action and let his actions reveal his motivations.
What would you tell somebody who is maybe thinking about writing a book? Maybe this is their first time out the gate, and I guarantee there's somebody that really would love to be where you are to say, I have 11 published books. Some people are thinking I can't even get one out the door. What would you say to somebody? What words of encouragement can you give them or help them along their journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just had a conversation with a friend of mine this past week who, ironically, she was raised in the Congo and her parents were missionaries there. So we were talking about the book that she wants to write. She essentially is a mom. She wants to write stories for her son. And so that's usually where I always start with people. Start with story, because whether you're writing nonfiction and you're telling some of your story, it's your story, you get to own it. Or whether you're writing fiction, you get to create this story world and imagine and dream and create these characters. So I always encourage first-time writers or writers who are still, getting, into the water, start with story and just begin making a list. What are the top 5, the top 10, the top 20 stories that really resonate with me, that really matter with me, and just begin chronicling those out. Once you do that, those pages will slowly begin to build. Then, once you amass a body of work, then you can think more structurally. Some people really need to begin with a theme first. My book is about this, and this is the theme that they want to go down. You could start there. Other people say, no, I just got a bunch of ideas. Okay, if you start with ideas, just begin to chronicle those ideas in a story format. And pretty soon, that book will begin to shape the form of it. I do think that a lot of first-time writers struggle with structure. And so that's where the more you start writing, you're going to see different themes and different story groups start to emerge. And so that's where I'd really encourage people to get started and to make it a regular practice, at least weekly. Some people, they don't have the opportunity to do it daily, but if you can get into a rhythm, a creative rhythm, I always tell the artists and writers I work with is that motivation is built by momentum. And once you get some momentum, those papers beginning to build up, those stories you're telling, that's going to develop more motivation to keep going.
Yeah, that's good advice. You had mentioned early in the conversation that you started out ghostwriting.
Yes, yeah.
So tell me about that. I've never met anybody who has written as a ghostwriter, and what exactly does that mean? Yeah,
so ghostwriting is when a writer comes alongside another established writer, and that ghostwriter is essentially writing either part or whole of the book, but it's the other person who has the experience, the context, and the whatnot. Ghostwriting projects can usually happen in terms of nonfiction. Okay, so when we see a book by a famous sports celebrity, it'll say, my life story by Kobe Bryant. Okay, and it'll say with John Brown. Okay, so if you see a with, that means Kobe told the story, but John actually wrote the story. That's called a with title. And so that's very common that, a writer who might have been a ghostwriter before, they've established themselves in the writing skills, and they will co-author books with other people. And it doesn't have to be a famous celebrity. I've had people ask me to, co-write books with them before. But the ghostwriting is where the real writer of the project or who's writing a part of it is hidden. So you don't know. But they're typically named in the acknowledgments. So sometimes when you see a book with a lot of different names in the acknowledgments, it's those people probably had a hand in shaping the book.
Sounds like ghostwriting is mainly for like memoirs, right? When people are telling their own story.
Yeah, it can be. It can be. It really just it comes together in a lot of different forms. Yeah.
So you have had a long career of being an author and writing. So what is probably the hardest thing about being an author that you've experienced?
Well, I think, and I have had different seasons because, right now the projects that I'm working on, They are their projects written on spec, that they were written without a contract with the publisher. Where in previous years, the majority of all my books went through traditional publishing routes. So the thing available to authors today, especially if you're a first-time author writing, as you know, you have Amazon KDP, you have all sorts of self-publishing routes you can go. Those, even from a traditional publisher's perspective, all those routes are completely valid now because self-publishing has become so strong, so powerful. There's not a lesser than category between self-publishing and a traditional publisher. So the thing that I think is important for authors to figure out is what route do they want to go. So for example, for my Among Kings book right now, I self-published that mainly because I wanted my older parents to get a copy of the book and for them to be able to see it and read it. But I also have an agent who is shopping it to other publishers. So you can go both routes, or you can pick one. If a person's going to write a book and submit it to a traditional publisher, it definitely has to follow a specific format. If it's a fictional book, they're going to want to see the whole novel first. If it's a nonfiction, they typically just submit a proposal. There's lots of good resources online on how to develop those proposals and make those submissions to traditional publishers. So I've really lived and worked in both spaces, and then the other challenge with self-publishing, it's self-publishing has the benefit that you get the majority of your royalties paid for your work, but at the same time you're doing all your own marketing, and so there's those challenges as well.
And that seems to be a huge challenge when I talk to people who self-publishing is, that I figured out the publishing process, I figured out the editing process, and, I got a book cover and formatting and copyright, but now what do I do, right? I've got this book, now I've got to market it. And I think is a misconception that a traditional publisher will do all the marketing for you.
It is a misconception because in a proposal nowadays to a traditional publisher, it's very important for that author who wants to get published by that traditional publisher. They need to list their social media following. They need to list what their part will be in the marketing. Publishers want to know if you have a speaking platform. Now, I don't want to discourage first-time authors listening who say, well, I have none of that. You just start right where you are, and you just take baby steps. You follow the breadcrumbs. You talk to people. You get yourself out there, and that's very similar to what musicians and actors and other creative people need to do. Anyone just starting a new business, you got to bust it and get your work out there.
I think I have come to the conclusion that if you're going to self-publish your book, you must be an entrepreneur. I have come to that conclusion in everything that I've learned with my journey, because I was a complete novice. I figured you would come on, you'd get a publisher, they would do everything for you, and you would be on book tour, cash in checks, cash in royalty checks. And that is such a huge misconception. And so I love it when people like yourself can come on and kind of guide us in the right direction. Right.
And there really are a lot of good online resources available to people. And so I'm always what I say, I'm a player coach. I'm right there with you. For those of you who are listening, I'm spending time during my week marketing my book, getting it out there. You're absolutely correct, Kelly. You do need to be entrepreneurial. You do need to take, if you really want to see your book get out there, you need to take it seriously like a business, okay? And it's time and energy and investment. And as people get familiar with your product and you start to build a small following, then you just keep building from there.
Yeah, I would agree. So thank you for that insight. So the last question that I have for you is, I always like authors to leave with some type of inspiration, words of wisdom, golden nuggets, as I call them. what would you like to leave with us today?
Well, I think it's really important as people sit down that they really think about to read in the genre that they want to write in. So that's the first thing that I would say. It's really important. If you want to be a writer, you need to be a reader, because as you read, you learn so much about writing. That's the first thing. And then if you're going to be a writer, writing is editing. And so whether you sit down and write 1 page a day, or if you can write 3, 4, 5 pages, realize that work is only going to become better as you edit and hone it. Don't expect to get it right the first pass. Give yourself a lot of grace, a lot of space, but keep at it, and eventually you'll really hone that written piece into something that you're proud of.
Joey, thank you so much for being here. I think that your story is absolutely fascinating. I learned something that I did not know about a true character, especially with Black History Month coming up. I had no idea about this guy. It's so interesting. But I would love to leave the door open for you to come back at any time and share more. If you ever want to come on and talk about your other books, happy. If you want to talk about your experiences in the Congo, I think it's fascinating. The door is always opened because you are now a member of the book club.
Great. Thanks for having me, Kelly. It was great being with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to another episode of Bright Headed Publishing Audiobook Book Club. I have been your host, Kelly Morgan. We just wrapped up with author Joey O'Connor. Joey shared with us his historical novel, Among Kings, which is now available on Amazon. He also has done some wonderful volunteer work in the Congo as well. Well, I want to thank Joey for being with us. If you are an author or someone who supports authors, like an editor or a graphic designer, we would love to have you become a member of the book club and be on the podcast. Email me at brightheadedpublishing@gmail.com. Again, that's brightheadedpublishing@gmail.com. Next Saturday, join us for another author. Can't wait. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, keep writing.